Hey everyone, Mark Edward Willows here. Welcome once again to Gabbin Cabin on a very special show. I have a gentleman here with me today that I'm telling you, I don't even know where to begin. He's an actor. He is a stand-up comedian. He is an author. And get this, he was the right-hand man of Frank Sinatra. I mean, does it get any better than that? And he is Tom Dreesen. Tom, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Mark. It's good to be back with you again. We go back a long way.
We do. As a matter of fact, we go back, Tom, I believe to about 1990. And isn't it amazing how we both still look the same?
I'll say you do, I don't.
So anyway, Tom, welcome. You have a very fascinating career. And of course, working with Frank Sinatra, it doesn't get any better than that. Now, I want to mention, a lot of people know, but you are originally from Harvey, Illinois. And I want you to elaborate a little bit, because I know you told me you used to shine shoes back in the day, and you heard the song Fly Me Away by Frank Sinatra. And you're sitting there just dreaming, thinking, well, and wouldn't you know, one of these days, that turned into reality. How did that happen, Tom?
I'm from Harvey, Illinois. First of all, let me apologize for my attire. I just came off the golf course. So if you're wondering why I'm
the place to come off from.
Yeah. But I was born and raised in Harvey, a suburb on the south side of Chicago, and very poor. There were eight of us kids, 4 boys and 4 girls. And we lived in a shack behind a factory called Ingalls and Shepherd, later called Wyman and Gordon. And we had no bathtub, no shower, no hot water. And that wasn't during the Depression. I'm not that old, but we were poor kids. So I shined shoes in taverns. I set pins in bowling alleys. I caddied in the summertime. I sold newspapers on the corner, all to help feed my brothers and sisters. And none of this do I regret. In fact, I always say when I give motivation talks, it's the greatest thing that ever happened to me to have been, have to grow up that way, because it taught you that you only deserve in life what you work for, and so I had a work ethic very early in life. But while I was shining these shoes, as you pointed out, in all these bars, Frank Sinatra was on every jukebox in those days. And there were 8 taverns. There were 36 taverns in Harvey, but there were 8 taverns in my neighborhood. And I shined shoes in those 8 taverns. And on every jukebox Frank was singing, but and I always say, we were singing, come fly with me, let's fly away. And years later, I was flying with him all over the United States, doing shows in 45 to 50 cities a year. And now I do a one-man show called The Man Who Made Sinatra Laugh. It's a 90-minute show, but it's basically about that, from Harvey to Hollywood, where, I take the audience from a little boy from Harvey, Illinois, shining shoes on his hands and knees in bars, and Frank Sinatra's on the jukebox. And then I take him to that same boy, is now a grown man, carrying Frank Sinatra's coffin out of a church in Beverly Hills, California. So I took that journey and all the funny stories and all the poignant stories and that I had to go through to get to that moment, but we can talk more about that.
Right. And you are one of the world's greatest stand-up comedians. I have seen your shows. You are fabulous. How did all that come about? Was it always the love of comedy, or did you just get up one day and say, this is what I want to do for a living? How did, Tom, all of that come about?
I never thought that I'd ever be in show business. I loved comedians before I was one, but I never, it was the furthest thing from my mind. But I always liked comedy. In the shack that we lived in, we had no television. We were that poor. We didn't have a television. We had an old radio, but they used to have a show. I mean, I listened to the Bob Hope show, the Jack Benny show on radio, but they had another show called Can You Top This? And it was like 5 comedians, and they'd throw a subject matter out, gas stations, and then they'd tell gas station jokes or whatever. And I always thought the art of joke telling was just amazing, that they could make people laugh. And while I was shining shoes in all the bars in my neighborhood, as I said, there were 8 of them. The last bar I would go to would be Polizzi's Tavern. My mother was a bartender there, and Frank Polizzi was my uncle, my mother's brother-in-law. And I would go there last to wait for the shifts to change in the factory, and I'd sit there, and then when the shift changed, I'd go back out and shine shoes again in all the taverns. But Frank Polizzi was a joke teller. He told jokes behind the bar, and I was fascinated that even as a little boy, that with his vocabulary and with his inflection on certain words, that he could cause this sound to come out of everybody's body that filled the air like electricity and united everybody. And I just loved the joke telling thing. So I told a lot of his jokes many that should not be told on a Catholic school playground, mind you. But and then, but I never thought I'd ever be in show business. When I was in the service, I'd tell jokes to the guys in the barracks and then aboard ship when I was aboard ship. And then when I came out of the service, I was a bartender in that same tavern. Two taverns, but one of the taverns, the same tavern my mother had been a bartender in, and my uncle had owned that tavern. So, but I told jokes behind the bar, and I get the customers laughing sometimes, and you get bigger tips. But then I joined the JCs, a civic group. I wrote a drug education program teaching grade school children the ills of drug abuse with humor, a concept I had. They weren't teaching drug education in those days at a college level or a high school level, let alone at an 8th grade level. But I thought you had to get to the kids before they went to high school. Tim Reed joined the JCs and joined me on this project. And he had graduated from Norfolk State College, and E.I. DuPont recruited him into Chicago as a marketing rep. He worked with me on this project. We went into the classrooms, and this program became very successful on how to teach drug education at an elementary school level. One day, a little 8th grade girl walking out of the classroom stopped us and said, "You guys are funny. You ought to become a comedy team." And the thought of a black-white comedy team intrigued us because no one had ever done that before. So we started writing what we thought was material. And there were no comedy clubs in America in those days. So, we went into a jazz club one night and asked the guy, could we get on stage? And we bombed, but the guy liked us. He said, come back tomorrow, try it again. We came back the next day and we scored, and then, so we stayed together for 6 years. And then the comedy team split up, and Tim went on, as you know, to become Venus Flytrap under the KRP situation. And I came up to the West Coast and struggled out here. I left my wife and 3 kids back in Chicago. I ended up sleeping in an old Nash Rambler out here, an old beat up car, not my car. It was on blocks, and the front seat came down. And I would hitchhike every night to the Comedy Store, begging to work for free every night. And they got on, and I worked my way through the system and finally got the Tonight Show to come and see me. Because in those days, wherever you went in America, in 1975, people say, what do you do for a living? He said, I'm a stand-up comedian. The next question out of their mouth was, oh yeah, have you ever been on Johnny Carson? If you hadn't been on Johnny Carson in the eyes of America, you just weren't a comedian. You might want to be one, but you weren't. You might going to be one, but you weren't one now. So I finally got to the Tonight Show, and I scored on my first time on. And Johnny, called me back through the curtain for a second bow, and then the third time I was on his show, I got to sit down and talk to Johnny, as you see in the picture behind me. To America, once you did stand-up comedy on the Tonight Show, you had arrived. To my industry, you hadn't arrived till Johnny sat and talked to you. That was when you really had arrived. I ended up doing 61 appearances on the Tonight Show. I did over 500 appearances on national television, over 50 on Letterman. I did all the talk shows in those days: Dinah Shore, Merv Griffin, Mike Douglas, Johnny Carson, Midnight Special, Rock Concert, Soul Train. I'm the only white comedian ever to do Soul Train. Then I started touring with Sammy Davis Jr. And for years, and I toured with Sammy for 3 years. And then I toured with Natalie Cole and Gladys Knight and the Pips. And I toured with Tony Orlando and Dawn. I toured with Frankie Avalon and James Darren, and then Smokey Robinson for a few years. And then finally meeting Frank Sinatra and touring with him for 14 years.
Wow. What a career, Tom. It's like a dream. I'm telling you, it really and truthfully is. Let me ask you, comedy, you're such an expert at it. How do you think, though, it has changed over the years? Because, today it's kind of, you got to watch everything. Where years ago, comedy was comedy. You win, it was all comical. What's your take kind of on it today?
What's changed more than anything in the world is the language, of course. When I started out, you could not go on television and say, go to hell. You couldn't swear at all. I mean, there was the television was only about this big. There was ABC, NBC, CBS, and like I say, how do we, you're in show business. That's 2 words, show and business. Well, how do I get known to the world? Well, you got to get on the Tonight Show. How do you get on the Tonight Show? You had to work clean. You had to write material that could make grandma and grandpa, mom and dad, and the kids laugh. So am I a prude? Hell no. I'm a street guy. I don't have a degree from academia. I got a doctorate from the streets. I grew up on the streets. 4 years in the military. I can do a stag roast with the best of them, but I couldn't make any money. I mean, the idea was you get on television, and then even corporate America, you could get many corporate dates, but they didn't want you working what we call blue, because you might, insult their clients, with that kind of language. So that's And then cable television came along, and all of a sudden you could work as filthy as you want. You know, people didn't have to watch it; they could turn it off or whatever. And that became popular. You know, again, I'm not a prude, but it's the easiest kind of comedy to write if you want to write, you know, risque new material. A few weeks ago, I was at the Laugh Factory trying out some new material here in Hollywood, the world famous Laugh Factory. And I was upstairs waiting to go on, and there were two young comedians around the corner, and they didn't know I was there, and I didn't know they were there. One of them said, you know, Tom Dreesen's here. The other comedian said, oh yeah, you know, he's old school. Well, they picked up my ears, you know. I listened, and the kid said, old school, what do you mean? He said, well, he doesn't use the F word. The other comedian said, he doesn't use the F word. What does he use for adjectives? I stuck my head around the corner and I said, adjectives.
Oh.
That's what I use for adjectives. But I'm not looking down on them. But, you know, the problem with the F word, it's a noun, it's a pronoun, it's an adjective, it's an adverb. Pretty soon it becomes a crutch. Anytime you go there all the time. And that's what's dramatically changed. The other thing that's changed is Steve Allen wrote a book in 1976 or 7 called Funny People. And in it, he wrote a chapter on me. And at that time, there were about 155 comedy acts, counting comedy teams, female comedians, male comedians, that made a good living in comedy that he talked about. Today, there's 20,000 comedians. Today, there were no comedy clubs in those days. And then one day there was 550 comedy clubs all over the United States. There were 3 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I mean, so this opened up this can of worms of all these comedians.
So what do you think, Tom, today it takes to make it in comedy? Because like you said, in your time, it was the Tonight Show. What is it today for someone to make it?
Social media. You better know how you can reach more people through. So there's comedians that do the Jimmy Fallon show or the Jimmy Kimmel show, and no one ever hears them, you know. I shouldn't say no one ever hears them, but in our day, one appearance on the Tonight Show, or prior to me, the Ed Sullivan Show, one appearance on Ed Sullivan Show, you'd be headlining in Las Vegas. You could go work for 2 years doing one Ed Sullivan Show. You'd be booked all around the country. In those days, 40 million people watch the show. Today, you can do those shows, and it's not going to launch your career, but social media. A comedian named Dane Cook, very funny guy.
Nice guy. I know him, actually, yes.
When MySpace first came out, Dane Cook monopolized that. He started selling out arenas, 15,000 seat arenas from the social media. That's what's changed more than anything. And again, the acceptance of any kind of material you want to do. You know?
And Tom, I need to ask you, because this is probably something all the viewers want to know. What was it like working with Frank Sinatra, and what was your personal relationship with Frank?
Well, to work with him, you know, I'll explain to you this way here. It's one of the greatest challenges any comedian would ever have to have, because I'll explain to you. So I say, Mark, you're going to open for Frank Sinatra now in 45 to 50 cities a year. Now, he sold out arenas of 20,000 people, and you worked in the round, you worked in the center. You didn't work proscenium where everybody's in front of you. They were behind you, they were all around you. So I say, Mark, it's 5 minutes now. We'll say we're at the Nassau Coliseum, you know, or the United Center in Chicago or whatever. I'd say, Mark, it's 5 minutes before you go, and I want you to go out there, Mark, and stand in the center of this arena. And I want you, there's 20,000 people out there. I want you to hold their attention for the next 45 minutes. Oh, one more thing, Mark. I want you to hold their attention for 45 minutes, but I want you to make them laugh for 45 minutes. Oh, one more thing, Mark. I want you to make them laugh when you want them to laugh. You know, I want you to pull the strings on the emotions of 20,000 people. No props, no tricks, no charts, no special arrangement, no special lighting, just you and 20,000 people. And one more thing, Mark, not one of them came to see you. That's your assignment. That's your assignment. So that's what it was like opening for Frank Sinatra. However, flying with him in his private jet all over the world, it was time to go on the road. And a limo would pull up in front of my house, and 2 big guys would come and carry my luggage down. They'd carry me down if I wanted to be carried down. And you get in the limo, they drive you right out to the airport, right onto the tarmac, right by the aircraft. Your luggage would be loaded. You walk aboard the aircraft. The moment Frank walked on the aircraft, he had a pilot named Johnny Spots. He'd say, let's go, Spots. And you take off down the runway. None of that pre-flight and pre-fueling. All that better be done. You know, we'd take off down the runway. We'd land in some city. Squad cars and limousines would rush us to the arena. You know, we'd be there like an hour before, put on your tuxedo, showtime, boom. You'd do your show, he'd do his show. He'd close with New York, standing ovations. You know, he'd rush off stage. Let's go, Tommy. We'd jump in the limo, head for the jet. We'd be flying over the venue. People weren't even in their cars yet. We're on our way to our next city, you know, hanging out till 6 o'clock in the morning. He never went to bed till the sun came up, whether we were on the road or off the road. So appearing in Las Vegas with him, in Tahoe and Reno and Atlantic City, staying in his home in Rancho Mirage, this huge compound. It was the most exciting life.
Oh, I'm sure. Now, how did Frank look at it? Do you think he looked at it that way, or did he just look at it as this is his job and this is what he does?
Toward the end, I mean, he had been doing this for so many years, all over the world, you know. So what lit him up toward the end of his life, in the years that I was with him, was that audience. You know, when he walked out and that light hit him, you know, and the roar of the crowd. To watch Frank's, I used to, before I ever met Frank, I saw his show a couple of times. He created more excitement walking to the microphone than most people create with the whole act. You know, when he walked out and walked into that arena, Mark, the crowd would just go wild. You know, they'd cheer and cheer and cheer. And then before he even sang his first song. You know? And when I'd go back with him, two things that I always remember. One was going back with him to New Jersey, you know, the Garden State Art Center. He's from Hoboken. This is their homeboy. This is their guy. You know, when he'd walk out on that stage in New Jersey, it would give you chills the way they would stand and cheer and cheer and cheer. And for me to appear with him in Chicago at the Chicago Theater, I mean, I appeared with him 6 or 7 times in Chicago at the Erie Crown Theater, Chicago Theater, Rosemont Horizon, the New World Theater, all those places. When we worked Chicago Theater, I used to take my shoe shine box down there on the IC from Harvey and get off at Randolph Street. And I'd go over by Chicago Theater while people were waiting to go inside, or sometimes at intermission, they come out, I try to shine their shoes because you got bigger tips there. And now one day I'm appearing on that same stage. My name is on the marquee with Frank Sinatra.
Wow. And after all what you've done and all these years, you're still standing, which is why you have written a book called Still Standing. And I want to talk a little bit about the book. How did that idea come up, Tom? Was it just something you got up, you wanted to do, or how did that happen? And I must add, I had the book. It's a fabulous book. I highly recommend it. But how did that all come about?
I'll tell you how it came about. From the day I went in the show business, every night, even when I was with Tim Reed, everywhere we were, if something very funny happened or something poignant happened, I would go back to the room and write it down, you know, and I accumulated all these stories and I put it in a book. You can't see it, but it says Stories of My Life. And in here are, you know, all kinds of, you know, that I accumulated through the years, you know, just stories of I wanted to remember these things to tell my grandchildren one day, you know, these moments with these special people, you know, sitting in Frank's house and out in the compound in the yard at 3 o'clock in the morning. All the women had gone to bed, and I'm sitting there with Gregory Peck. I'm sitting there with Jack Lemmon. I'm sitting there with Kirk Douglas. I'm sitting there with Robert Wagner. I'm sitting there with Clint Eastwood and Frank Sinatra. And these are all the people I saw in the movies in Harvey Theater when I was a little. And now when I'd go back to my bungalow where I stayed at, I would, you know, write any stories down, not telltale stories, but moments and funny moments. And stuff. I accumulated those stories. And a couple of years ago, 2 guys called me. They said, hey, we've got a deal with the publishing company. We want to do a story on your life. We think your life has been very exciting and very interesting. So we'd like to do. I said, gee, guys, I've already written this, and I've been thinking about doing a book, you know, just basically for my grandchildren. But I made a deal with them that I sent them all my chapters, and they would, you know, help me with the chapter and say, can we take that one line out of chapter 3 and put it in chapter 5, and, you know, whatever. We put together this book, Still Standing. My subtitle is My Journey from Streets and Saloons to the Stage and Sinatra. And it's basically from Harvey to Hollywood. You know, and still, I want to say one more thing. Still Standing is a double entendre. I'm a stand-up comedian now for 52 years. So I'm still standing. But the other part of it is I've been knocked down a lot in my life. And I mean physically knocked down. You read the books and you know. I've had some hard times, but I kept getting back up again. So it's a book of triumph. And that's why I think why people like the book, because, you know, you didn't give up. You hung in there. You know?
And who were, briefly, who were some of the famous people, best people you've ever worked with? Who comes to mind?
Well, you can't not leave out Frank Sinatra.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can't top Frank.
Well, but I tell you, touring with Sammy Davis Jr., I took him 3 years. sitting in the wings every night to watch Sammy Davis Jr. was like show business 101. It was incredible what this guy could do with audiences. He could sing as good as anybody out there. He could dance better than anybody out there. He could do comedy as good as any comedian. He could do impressions better than any impression I ever saw. He could play the trumpet. He could play the drums. He could play the piano.
Tom, do you think the comedians like Sammy and all of them back in the day, do you really think that was the golden era? Do you think, in your opinion, they were better back then than some of the young ones today?
What I say is when you go and you watch these, and they're great shows. I mean, and you watch these big arenas, they electrify audiences. A lot of it is with laser lights and all this technology.
Yeah.
Sammy Davis Jr. was a laser light.
Mm-hmm.
Frank Sinatra was a laser light.
Mm-hmm.
When they walked out, they lit up the room.
Mm-hmm.
The talent lit up that room,
Mm-hmm.
So, again, I'm not taking anything away from the acts of today, but these guys paid more dues too. Sammy Davis Jr. paid dues since he was 2.5 years old when he wandered out on the stage with his dad and his uncle. I mean, that Smokey Robinson, touring with Smokey, Smokey calls me baby brother. We're like brothers. We've been together. I ran 26 miles every year for multiple sclerosis for my sister Darlene. She had MS. It was called 26 miles for Darlene. Smokey, I'd bring in 20 celebrities and they'd run a block or two or a mile or two with me. And Smokey's the only one who ran all 26 miles with me. So Smokey, as we're speaking right now, Smokey's getting a check from ASCAP. He's written over 4,000 songs.
Wow.
Can you imagine that? If you wrote 10 songs in your life, Mark, I'd say to you, wow, you're a genius, Mark. 10 songs that got recorded, you're a genius. Smokey wrote over 4,000 songs. He's still singing today and singing as good as he ever sung. He was a joy to be with. Of course, being in the I'm an actor, but I'm a stand-up comedian first, last, and always. But to sit around, as I pointed out earlier, night after night at Frank's compound with Kirk Douglas, Gregory Peck, Clint Eastwood, Clint, a buddy of mine, Frank introduced us 38 years ago, and we've been friends ever since. But their knowledge of this industry of acting, their knowledge of directing, to sit around with them and absorb it like a sponge. I've been very, very fortunate.
Yeah, I want to talk also, Tom, about your one-man show, because you're going to be coming to Glen Ellen, Illinois now in September. Tell us briefly a little about that.
The show is called The Man Who Made Sinatra Laugh, and it's stand-up comedy. And yet what happens is the theater goes dark. They're playing Sinatra music, but the theater goes dark, and Dennis Farina, God rest his soul, narrates a film of my life. And then I come out with stand-up comedy, and then I do about 30 minutes of stand-up, and then I segue over to a bar, and on stage is a bar, and there's a bottle of Jack Daniels on the bar, which is Frank's drink of choice, and I tell a real funny joke at the bar, and all the lights go out in the theater, and Frank comes on the screen singing. Like, to me, it's 2:45. There's no one in the place except you and me, and one for my baby. And I when it gets to the chorus, make it one for my baby and one more for the road. He goes off screen and a spotlight hits me, and now the audience, I'm in a bar and the audience is in a bar with me, and I've come home. And I tell them that. The first time I heard that voice, I was 10 years old, shining shoes in a bar in Harvey, Illinois.
Okay, and that's coming up at Glen Ellen, September the 10th. Where can people go for tickets or what? Check out your website. How can they do it?
You can go to tomdreesen.com, and there's a link that'll click you right to the Ticketmaster, right? Tom, DREESEN.com, because everybody spells my name wrong for some reason.
And Tom, we're kind of out of time, but before we go, one thing I want to ask you, what does the future still hold for Tom Dreesen? Is there anything more that you can do? Because you just amaze me at what you have done. And I think you are such a role model for anybody that wants to be in the entertainment business at all. And, from the low to the high to back to the low to the high, you've done it all. And what do you got planned yet? Will there ever be a movie about your life story? Anything coming up? What can you tell us?
Well, once you do the Mark Edwards Willow show, it's all downhill from here. So but right now, Netflix is, first of all, they're doing a documentary on my life, and we've already filmed, Smokey Robinson and Joe Mantegna and we've got a lot of other people to do. And they got film clips of my shows and the things and my whole life. And we're halfway through that documentary now. And so that'll be what I'm still working on. Also, I love stand-up comedy. I love making people laugh. I won't do it for you, but I once wrote a poem called The Sound of Laughter. And as far back as I can remember, or shortly thereafter, I love to hear the sound of laughter. That's the opening line. So I want to continue doing shows. I don't think I'll ever write another book. That was a lot of work. But again, the documentary and the performing around the country. And the other thing is I love motivating people. I've read literally hundreds of books on the powers of the mind. And I give motivation talks for corporate America. But I give it to young comedians too, a thing called the joy of stand-up comedy and how to get there. So I'm just going to keep busy, and I'm going to play a lot of golf, and who knows?
I know every time we talk on the phone, you're on the golf course. I always get you on the golf course.
I caddied when I was a little boy in Homewood, Illinois, at a place called Ravislow Country Club, and I fell in love.
It's still there.
Yeah, and it's still there. Yeah,
yeah.
And I go back once in a while to play there. I love the game, and it's and I'll tell you real quick why. Growing up in that poverty that I grew up in, my father was an alcoholic. He drank in all the bars. I thought that success was one day I'd like to own a bar maybe, or be a bartender, because that's where my dad spent all of his money. I couldn't think outside of my environment. And then I went to caddy at Ravislow Country Club, and I was meeting doctors and lawyers. Mr. Florsheim from Florsheim Shoes, doctors, lawyers, these people who treated me like a son and not like a servant. And after 2 or 3 years out there, I thought, well, maybe I could be more than just a bartender. That's why I understand when the poor kid in the ghetto says he wants to grow up one day to be a pimp or to be a drug pusher, because he's never seen anybody more successful than that. They come up in beautiful cars with hundreds of dollars of bills, so they can't think past their environment. Right. So that's why I love golf, what golf has done for me. Yeah. And through the years, because of my love for golf, I performed at the AT&T for 30 years, Bob Hope Classic. Bob brought me there. Every time I performed for these golf tournaments, there were corporate America, Fortune 500 in the audience. So I get more work, so golf is really good.
And finally, because we're really running short on time, any advice, Tom, that you have for anyone that wants to get into entertainment or comedy? What's your advice?
Well, I give advice to anybody who, not even comedy, comedians, but to everybody out there listening. This is your blink of an eye on this planet. This planet's been here for billions of years, and it's going to be here for billions of years after you die. So your lifetime in this planet is a blink of an eye. It's over that fast. Don't spend one moment of that blink of an eye not chasing your dream. Don't spend one moment of that blink of an eye bitching and moaning and cursing your lot in life. Every day is a celebration. This wonderful life that we've got, that we're so lucky to be here. So chase follow your dream. This is your blink of an eye. If you're a comedian, start where you are. If you live in Toledo, start in Toledo. Work as often as you can. Get up on stage every chance you get, everywhere. Volunteer for free stuff. That's what I did. Read the book, The Magic of Believing. If you don't believe in yourself, you can't expect others to believe in you. 4, realize no one is ever going to help you. It's up to you. And number 5, don't ever quit. Bertram Russell once said, there are people in show business who become major stars simply because they didn't have sense enough to quit when they should have. And that's my story. I should have quit 10 times, but I never did. And I hung in there. And
excellent advice. Tom, as always, pleasure having you on the show. Once again, Still Standing is the book. Check it out. Get a copy. It's a great book. Glenn Ellen Show coming up September 10th. And be checking out tomdreesen.com for the latest stuff that's going on. And once again, Tom, just great seeing you. And I'm just, like I told you at the beginning of the show, it's amazing how neither one of us has changed over the years.
Yeah, well, you're very lucky also. You've probably got the greatest producer in this business.
I do. I thank God every day. He's going to go toot his horn. Now, Tom, thanks for being on the show.
Okay, it's good to talk to you.
Bye-bye.
Tommy, come out and take a bow. Tommy Dreesen, ladies and gentlemen. Funny man.